episode 158.
Welcome to the Wellness Show, a podcast on health and wealth. I'm your host, Tyhson Banighen, the founder of the Extraordinary Healing Arts Academy. Join me as we get the latest insight, tips, and strategies from wellness providers, coaches, and successful, heart-centered entrepreneurs, and much, much more.
Welcome to the Wellness Show, and today I'm excited to interview Michael O'Connor, who is returning to the show once again. And today we're going to be talking about a very exciting topic, and that is, this is the first in a series of interviews where we'll share his insights about the rapidly emerging paradigm of holism. This paradigm explains how and why astrology and holistic healing and methodologies work together. We'll also shed light on the intrinsic connection these disciplines share and why the holistic approach is invaluable to the healing process. And so without further ado, welcome Michael O'Connor back to the show.
Thank you very much, Tyson. Really happy to be here.
So to start us off, let's talk a bit about humanistic astrology. How is that different than other forms of astrology, and how did you get excited by humanistic astrology?
Humanistic astrology came to me naturally. In my teens, I began studying astrology, and I was just learning the basics then. But rather soon thereafter, in a few years later, my 20s, when I began to get really serious about it, I just found myself gravitating towards the psychological aspects of astrology more than the predictive. So humanistic astrology can best be described as modern Western astrology. It's where not all practitioners go in that direction. It's the one that can be described as that which looks at who you are most deeply, who you are, why you're here, and what constitutes your destiny, and celebrates free will significantly. So it's more of an astrology of possibility than of probability. Traditional astrology is where we get into prediction. So even a humanistic astrologer will touch on the predictive side, the traditional side, but it doesn't lean on it. It uses it as a feature of what it's interested in doing, but it's not all about a person sitting back and getting their future foretold. That's what a traditional astrology does, and it limits free will at worst. It becomes autosuggestive also at worst. It turns astrology into kind of just merely, there's a power in being able to predict the future. But it disempowers us as free will agents. So this is where the humanistic astrology component comes forward and celebrates us as souls incarnate who have a destiny, and a feature of that destiny is free will. So that's so important. And free will is a topic we can discuss at length all on its own, but in the most basic sense, it can be defined as like a divine function of the human species. Because we're not merely solely instinct driven. We use faculties of intuition, reason, and logic, etc., as well as instinct, and we plan for the future and we co-create. So these words start to come forward very quickly with that perspective. So yeah, humanistic astrology is fairly new. One could say it has about, it sort of began about 120 years ago to emerge. It has even further reaches back at we can go as far back as the Renaissance, but really about the 1700s, but most specifically, really the turn of the 20th century is when it began to come forward more and more and more. And probably the strongest proponent, or really the pioneer of it, is an astrologer by the name of Dane Rudhyar. Dane Rudhyar, an Aries sun sign, Sagittarius rising philosopher and
Yeah.
humanist, found, by his destiny, the importance of weaving astrology with a more depth psychological perspective. And he was in touch with, thinkers like Carl Jung and for others, many others. I've just gone blank on the many contributors in other areas of human disciplines, like astrology all on its own was kind of going there, but he most significantly grabbed it and ran with it, and by way of many books, elaborated upon what he meant by it. So
is that the link, Michael, that takes us to holistic or holism from an astrological perspective? Was it his work that started to look at it as more as a way of approaching it on a systems perspective?
He wasn't the only one to bring forward the holism, but he certainly was a strong proponent. And yeah, like astrology went dormant from when the scientific revolution really kicked in around 1700, and then it for a good couple of hundred years there until the late 1800s, it was sort of in a hibernation, went underground, and then it was revived. Yeah, there was a revival which accompanied what's called the Western occult tradition. A revival, people like the Golden Dawn and Blavatsky and others, esoteric thinkers, etc. And all of this was coinciding with astrological aspects, of course. It's always synchronicity of that is always there, like planets and signs, etc. Synchronizing with this. It was particularly Neptune in Pisces and then Neptune in Aries, which is just so happens we're currently experiencing again. So we're in another phase.
Right.
That's another story. The holism really also can be basically described as a growing realization that we live in a conscious universe. So the scientific revolution comes along, refutes anything that has to do with anything religious or esoteric or metaphysical, and goes hard with a materialistic model, which in a lot of ways was good in a positive sense, but it at worst, even to this day, tenaciously holds on to unfounded notions. And the holistic movement, was occurring not only in many fields, astrology, medicine, and science, especially in the physics department, and that's what we generally refer to as quantum physics. It is so the quantum physics world, has and had, and it still has, very significant proponents from, along the way who have elaborated the understanding that, mystical assertions like, the idea that matter is empty. It's mostly space, and so there's rather mystical realizations emerging. But keeping it simple, holism is linked to this ancient spiritual understanding of that we live in a conscious universe. In a more fundamental, grounded sense, we can say it's a body, mind, heart, and soul model. So when we speak of any approach to holism, it invariably has to incorporate what can be described as a four-cornered principle: body, mind, heart, and soul. Soul is not, and heart can be a little bit romantic terms. We might say body is physical, of course. Mind is intellect and consciousness that we're processing. Emotion is more what we mean by heart, and soul is more the understanding that we have an auric field. It has layers to it. We have chakras, divine beings in this dimension. So it gets into this whole language of dimensionality, etc., which again, mainstream science was and continues in a lot of respects to refute but it's coming on hard and fast, just by its
Right.
just by its very nature.
So could you maybe, this is maybe a short form, but could we maybe say then that the mechanistic holism sees space as empty, and that holism, in the term that you're using, is that it's full of spirit, or it's full of energy, or it's full of consciousness, and that this is the huge paradigm shift that we're in the midst of coming to realize, which is actually being, as you would say, supported by quantum mechanics and string theory and all the rest of this.
Yeah, the physics, there's invariably proponents from basic, we'll call both sides, and they're presenting pretty good arguments. And the jury's out, especially with the materialistic model, but the conscious universe model, is was so convincing, and the arguments are so compelling, and of course they almost invariably go into a philosophy department perspective. But what's happening is as they do with each day, they're giving increasingly more credence to the metaphysical model that's very ancient, what can be described as esoteric science, or what we now call holistic science, or the metaphysical model, which represents the understanding that we are multidimensional beings living in a multidimensional universe. So, and astrology is based on that. It works on that basis. But the notion of a conscious universe is evident, one would say, I would say myself, although this is argued, that it's self-evident. In other words, there's shape and design to existence. And if there's shape and design to anything, then something had to be shaping and designing. And that's, the most basic way of saying it. That nobody in the world's going to convince anybody else that a computer put itself together, but everybody refers to the brain as the most powerful computer in the universe or in the world. So it's like, what are we talking about here? This is the most powerful computer. Now, others would say, oh, well, computers are going to exceed the brain. Well, fine, maybe in technological respect it can, but don't unplug that thing. Don't unplug it. That'll be the end of that. And it needs a whole societal infrastructure. So we're the gods of it, if you like, in that regard. Hopefully that'll remain true, unless we run into Terminator days. But anyway.
I can certainly attest to that. I call my computer the one-eyed God, and it does demand certain homage and certain prayers be said for it to operate. But, in the end, I just say, well, look, we'll just pull the plug and re-scramble your brain and start all over. So, is there God in the computer? No, not really. Is there something greater than the computer? Yes, it's our consciousness. And is there something greater than our consciousness? Absolutely. It's beyond our limited brain. And then it gets really exciting, because now we're back to the holism that you're talking about, that gets reflected through who we are, and allows us to, like you said, literally be able to understand the concept of free will. Because without it being that type of universal structure, where does free will come in? And where does our ability to become well and whole begin and end?
It's hard not to upset people when you talk about holism, in the sense that it basically asserts that we're God experiencing itself, but it doesn't present God as some anthropomorphic Jovian figure who gets mad if you cross him. That kind of notion of projecting our own, made in his image kind of consciousness onto the gods, really it was a form of ancient astrology. So basically, by the way, there's an ancient astrology which is very fairly superstitious, but ironically, ancient astrology was deeply interested in the holistic model, in the sense they generally interpreted that there must be gods in the planets, so the notion of gods as planets like Jupiter and Saturn, etc., was coming from this realization that there's seems to be the theme of synchronicity was occurring, and they were recognizing it. They're saying, whenever that planet or that star is in that position, these things seem to occur. So, this is the beginning of science, actually, astrology, in terms of measuring lunar cycles and planetary cycles and seasonal cycles. And of course, very quickly, we begin to think practically, how can we harness this knowledge? That's a quick, just close this because there's a quick look at the whole theme of the origins of astrology very briefly here. So the priest the priest class or craft, if you like, and the scientists were more or less one and the same. The observers, the scribes, the keeping of the records, the observations, the recognitions, the endeavor to work with nature, to get clues, hints, insights, anything that will help us offset, the perils of nature, whether it's the weather, generally speaking, weather is the big one, always, and other vagaries like, things, whether it's storms, forest fires, but weather, really, it comes down to that. So anyway, the ancient model, took this position of recognizing and began to get very serious about watching, and science really emerged right there. And it became religious, too, because, there was a sort of an awe and a reverence and a regard and a kind of a fear of, you don't want, these are big power players. You don't want to get those guys mad. So ancient astrology, filled with sacrifices and sort of nasty things that we might think about in this day and age, blood sacrifices and all these terrible superstitious behaviors. And traditional astrology sort of emerged out of that as more of the personal horoscope. That began historically about 500 BC, actually, so it wasn't that recent, 2,500 years ago. And astrology was still in a very progressive mode, and once it got it was very strong in the Middle East and in India, and once the Greeks and the Romans got a hold of it, they really began to ground it into a more applicable science, and that's where Western astrology comes from, ancient Rome, really about the turn of the 2 millennia, about the time of Jesus, interestingly enough, as the history goes. Anyway, I'm just giving you a quick,
Yeah. So when there was a connection made between planetary systems and the body parts, when did that happen? Was that sometime in the Middle Ages, or was it prior to that? Was it with the Greeks and the Romans, or when did that occur?
That's a very good question. It probably did begin about that time, yes, when ancient astrology was becoming more traditional astrology. So probably about beginning around 500 BC it started. And it's hard to trace the roots in as clear a way as one would like. Vedic tradition in India would, lay claim to astrology, having been practiced, and in China too, early on. But, in the Middle East, there was always networks of communication between the Middle East and India, even China. But basically, ancient astrology goes back at least kind of 12,000 years ago.
Right.
By the way, there's early traces. So it's hard to know with any absolute certainty where those associations began. But one can begin to say they began there because the medical aspect of astrology became important in those days too, but it really probably emerged most strongly in about 500 BC, and it started to become an astrology that was directed initially to the king of the land, but increasingly more and more people wanted their own astrology. It was
right.
the king or the leader would be like a symbol and a representative, like God's representative on earth. So you can see some of like the notions of the Pope today and other king-like figures are sort of meant to be God's representative. So that kind of consciousness really is still in what would be called Saturnian consciousness, very traditional, very ancient roots.
Right. And I guess at some point it became the sort of the job description of the court fool, or not so much the court fool. That that's really a corruption of the magi that used to be the counselor to the what was in the Chinese court or in the ancient courts, or I'm thinking about, or even in the Egyptian court where there was Hermes, Trismegistus, who said above as above so below. I mean, they were the counselors that were looking at the stars and the predictive aspects and providing insights for the ruler, or to be able to align with the cosmological unfoldment that was in the stars in order to replicate that on the earth, so that his reign was supported by the gods or the energies of the stars or planets, or however you wanted to describe it. And so that intermediate role was extremely important for their survival.
Yes, it was a very communion-based consciousness. It was like a science and a religion merged, and it had a lot of ritual. It had a desire to commune, a desire to be in alignment with, a desire to appease higher reality, higher forces. And it was probably exercised in different ways in different places, but there would have been a general similarity that there's larger forces at play. We see and recognize that they're at play, and that would have been the word might not have been the word synchronicity. That's what they were noticing. They were observing, wow, right, synchronicities occurring here, and they invariably kind of projected anthropomorphic notions of various different types of players, not just a god, not a one god, but that emerged later. The notion of the one god, which itself, it was kind of its own issue because it's an impoverished notion. In other words, if one says God is one versus there is only one God, suddenly you have a holistic mindset. Like, in other words, it's trying to say all of these gods and all things in the universe and all things that exist are all connected as a part of a greater whole. That's what holism is all about. And even in ancient times, there was people who intuitively and so forth knew that's what it really meant. But you're dealing with a largely uneducated populace, which was superstitiously driven and survival based. So they would, of course, the king and the leaders would have to present a rather powerful, ominous presence, and they would have to be intermediaries, etc. So all of this is sort of describing ancient astrology, but it touches on how the holistic notion was always there. But it took, through time and the progress of culture, the march of civilization, for it to become increasingly more refined and to sort of change its posture. So for a long time, ancient astrology can be described as having been around the longest in terms of how long it was around.
Right.
Traditional astrology has been around the second longest, and we could probably say from about 500 BC. That's what's sometimes referred to as Hellenistic, the Greeks. The Greeks were very passionate. As we know in our history, the Romans admired the Greeks, and the Greeks admired the Egyptians, and the Egyptians admired the Babylonians, and the Babylonians admired the Indians from India. So there was always this, passing on of knowledge and who was respecting who and why. That was largely based on their level of sophistication of wisdom, science, And almost invariably, almost always, that science was based on astrology in every culture. Because astrology and astronomy weren't seen as different. They understood, they were more communal, they were more holistic, actually. They, just by their very instinctual response to what was going on. But when traditional astrology was more the personal horoscope, that's where we began to move into more of a direction of refinement, where astrologers, not just the priestcraft now, and serving the king and they're a class of scribes and observers and just the priestcraft, really, which were a mixture of science, religion, etc. in ancient times. But when the traditional astrology began to emerge, certain people became astrologers. And then they might have, let's say, they were learned, of course, in mathematics. They were very bright people. They would have to have been very educated to the best of their ability, and they would have then wealthy clients. Hey, I'm not the king, but I'll pay you. I'll pay you a lot. Matter of fact, I would like to not only pay you, I'm not the king, but I might be sort of this wealthy person, but I'd like, you can live here and, I'll make you rich. If you can make me, you can tell me things, if you can give me the cutting edge, if you can give me the advantage, not necessarily over my enemies, but probably often, but just anything that can give me the insight, the lead, the edge, etc., well, I'm in, right?
It sounds like the beginning of an insurance policy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, anything to, life's perilous and we're fragile beings, and, we want anything that will give us more power and opportunity and advantage. So astrology, yes. So I'm kind of just quickly clarifying that there's stages of astrology, and modern humanistic astrology is only like 120 years old. It's linked with the march of modern psychology, but it's not merely based on brain consciousness. It incorporates a more holistic spiritual model that we're souls incarnate. Modern psychology, at worst, sort of defers to a more brain-stimulating, kind of manipulating mindset. It's a materialistic model at worst. Although a lot of psychologists don't think that way, and they'll be everything from Buddhists to metaphysicians to intuitives to psychics. Modern psychologists will. They have to make a living, so they go, well, I'll become a psychologist. But they can very often at least closet mystics, psychics, astrologers, everything. And then there will be that group among them that are staunchly more, whether you call it Western mainstream materialistic model. But just to differentiate too, so that's why I wanted to take a bit of time to do this. Astrologers are different too. So most astrologers even today aren't humanistic. They're not humanistic. They're still operating on a traditional approach because that's what most people want, and it's sort of easier in a way. It's an art on its own to be predictive in an accurate way, but it goes against the momentum and movement of free will and the human potential movement. It becomes limiting, and it's based on what might be described as really an outdated appreciation of who and what we are. Like, increasingly, human beings with modern civilization are developing increasingly a realization that we do have free will, and that we do have choices, and that we can change, and that we can engage in our destiny in a co-creative way. But the traditional approach is more interested in trying to predict, which I have always interpreted as bringing more attention to the astrologer than to the client. But over the years, because I came by doing what I do the way I do it kind of naturally, I sort of innocent. I didn't say, oh, I'm going to become a humanistic astrologer like in a very conscious, objective way. It's just, it happened. That's just by nature who I am. And along the way, at times, not often, but earlier, that wasn't very well understood by my clients. They wanted me to prove things, which in a way,
So
yeah.
maybe it would help, like, if, for example, if I was to come to you and ask for a humanistic astrology session, what sort of things could I expect to?
Okay, well,
yeah, what sort of things would that involve? Or
okay. The difference between humanistic versus a traditional predictive is that a predictive is always trying to show you the weather over the course of the next 3 months or 6 months or a year, or what's going on and when it's going to happen, which is valuable, and a humanistic astrologer will do that too. But in humanistic astrology, the focus for first session, second session, third even, is more who are you? Why are you here? What's your, like, what's beating in your heart? And so some people will say, well, you didn't tell me anything you know. I don't know. But I'll say, well, how did I know to say anything that was accurate? How could I even? So it becomes a celebration of playing, I call it the checklist. If I can play back to you who you are, however, I can do it in such a way that's going to awaken you to who you are in a way different than what your self-concept holds about yourself is the goal. So you feel excited about being you. You feel...
Yeah, maybe I could jump in and say just how powerful that is, because as you know, most of us are already caught up in this paradigm, call it the matrix or however you want, and we're trying to fulfill those goals that are set by society or all the external forces outside of us. So most of us don't know who we are and don't know how to show up and be authentic. So what you're saying to them is, I can show you the authentic you of why you showed up in the way that you are on planet Earth. And once you know that, then you have a choice in every moment. Do you want to bring that part that's connected to source into play, or do you want to regress back into trying to fit into the paradigm that you are not meant to fit into? Because if you do, you lose your way. So I can see there's a real power in what you're offering people.
Yes, it's true. It takes a certain amount of courage, like, in other words, leaning on mainstream society and going with its trends and flows is easier. You just kind of plug in, and now that's valid and fine. It's not for me to say what people should do, but the danger at worst is you begin to sort of fall asleep spiritually. You find yourself engaging in shallow activities that aren't so meaningful, and you lose touch with a sense of who you are, why you're here, which sort of becomes, as you said, authentic, call it adventurous, and begins to take on a whole new meaning to be alive. You become what can be described as here now, in a new way of feeling like, wow, I'm no longer an ego wondering whether I have a soul. Now this has activated the realization that I'm a soul and I have an ego, and that changes everything. Now you have to kind of digest that. Doesn't mean immediately everybody does that. Their usual way of thinking is still occurring. And so that switch can take time. Sometimes it's very quick. It means that the person's always been there. But yeah, so this is where you're right about the terms, language. It touches on what we now call authentic. Authentic's not just cool, hip, in tune, kind of sort of a rock star kind of image that suddenly you've got you're in the right place. And you've just got the right body type, and you're sort of particularly sexy, and you're famous and rich kind of mentality. Somehow that suddenly becomes authentic, and everybody else is sort of an idiot and a loser. And so it can also create a bit of aggressive competition. But if one gets into their authenticity in a real, genuine way, the competition goes away in the way it would otherwise, because the fear factor, which is more egocentric, diminishes. One becomes more, well, quite frankly, heart-centered, and because if you're heart-centered, you're soul-centered, and vice versa, and it also equates to being more here now, and you can sort of feel more focused on what constitutes your own fulfillment, and notions of competition and sort of merely and solely and purely focusing on advantage on one hand, or here, Tyson. I think something's gone on your end. There we go.
No, you're back. You're live. We're live again. We thought you had died and gone to heaven.
Oh,
but no, Michael is back. He's back from the living. I mean, back with the living. And we were talking about what it means to be authentic, and what does it mean to be in that place where you can show up and be the best that you can be in a non-competitive way, because you're unique and different from anybody else. So there's really no competition.
Yeah, and it starts to touch on your destiny, who you are as a soul, where you're at in your journey, and you know, it can look at not just what your. And when we say destiny, that word is not easily and quickly defined. It's sort of basically your destiny is to be fully who you are. Who you are is, you know, subject to time and space and outer realities. So you have to, you know, be with the times enough to say you're in the world, but you suddenly are increasingly less of the world. Of the world means you're very trendy, you're very outer directed, and you're always watching what others doing. But at worst, it produces an insecurity, a type of shallowness. You know, you're not guided by your own inner intuition. The same thing if one's heart-centered and the heart chakra is really operative, your intuitions are stronger, and you know, increasingly so, and you know, they become more aware of what is or is not their truth, you know, and so on. So you start to get into a chakra perspective to some extent. What I mean by that is, there's a saying by a spiritual teacher who I admire greatly. His name's Invaluable. He says most people operate, there's a loop between their throat chakra and their solar plexus. The throat is more their opinions, solar plexus is their convictions. So it's opinion-driven conviction, and very few ever really access the heart chakra, he says, which is not about sentimentality, etc. It's about truth and intuition and what would be described as knowing, you know, this state of intuitively knowing things. Now, that's just, you know, a lot of people, they may lapse there, but they don't know that they are. And then, you know, so but the more one becomes conscious of that principle, that consideration, they go, wow, I really want to exercise a heart-centered consciousness. The more I'm developing my intuition and vice versa, it becomes spiritual, but it's not spiritual in some allegiance to some external ism. You know,
Yes.
You know, we can enjoy Buddhism and Hinduism and Christianity and all we can enjoy those and we can benefit from them, but we're not kind of forfeiting ourselves. Those become, in as wholesome a way as I can possibly say it, means to an end. They're not the end. A religion becomes the end is the beginning of a kind of a prejudice between the two. But the more that the religion and its various techniques and practices and philosophy become a means, the more we look at them and go, wow, I can kind of like going shopping in the grocery store where there's all kinds of products from all kinds of countries and all kinds of different companies. You go pick and choose, right? Why wouldn't you do that with anything? Right? Not right? If you can do that with food, you you can do that with shoes, if you can do that with clothing, why wouldn't you do it with also beliefs and philosophies? And so, see where I'm going?
There's a belief out there, Michael, I feel erroneous, but there is a belief, well, if you do that pick and choose and you use religions, as a smorgasbord, and you take a little from here and there, some people believe that you've lost your way. But what you're really saying is, no, there's a perennial philosophy when you're connected to source or God or whatever you want, or mind, that is beyond all of the ways that it's been described or boxed up or promoted or sold as a religion. And so the religions become really helpful stepping stones to help you get to a deeper understanding. So that's really what we're talking about.
Yes, people can, you can subscribe to a particular religious tradition, like whether you're talking about Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, maybe even Islam, I'm not sure. But even there's different flavors, different sects. So which one is it? And stuff like that. And it becomes kind of a ridiculous kind of competitive arena, and it becomes dogmatic. And then religion is no longer embracing and communing and heart-centered and intuitive. It's now competitive and evil. It's kind of like, right. What? You're not supposed to be evil, but, Western traditions, especially, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are particularly kind of evil at worst. They're very narrow, very aggressive, very elbowing, very dogmatic. Now, if one wants to kind of fully embrace the tradition of any of them and immerse themselves into it, and because they feel that it's more comprehensive and cohesive and it'll be more effective, that's great. But let's not get carried away with what's the truth here. Let's not go, this is
exactly.
It's like,
the precautionary note is that the Holy War, the Crusades, is still ongoing. So we have to be aware that that the use of religion in its very negative form is mind control. Now, we're not saying that the precepts, the perennial philosophies, to love thy neighbor and like you love yourself, and all the rest of those precepts aren't valuable. Of course they are. They move you towards the perennial philosophy. But, really it comes down, is what you believe in putting you in bondage or binding you up, or is it giving you freedom? And if it's giving you the freedom, then we're back to what you're talking about, which is you having control over your own human destiny. And that's what we're really talking about, is right. How do we show up where we know that we are sovereign human beings responsible for creating our own reality with every thought, word, deed, and act. And what you're telling us is human astrology will help you discover those aspects of yourself.
Yes, it invites, in a nice way of saying it, it invites a co-creative process. It reminds you of your essential divinity. It reminds you indirectly that, we live in a conscious universe that's purposeful, intentional, loving, creative, and cooperative too. So the universe is, obviously all things in nature cooperate. So we are made in its image, but with this, we're not, again, speaking of an anthropomorphic man image, but we're made in the image of nature, because we're not simply in nature. That's the ego mind. Ego mind's separate and divisive, but the communal state, like we are it experiencing itself, and it no longer is some God located in a place that likes some and not others, and it's judgmental and fierce, but it becomes like, how do you even begin to describe an all-pervasive, omnipotent intelligence that it seems paradoxical, and language starts to fall short of what we're talking about. But we know that there is an intelligence, an intentionality, a purpose, a rhyme and a reason, and astrology taps right into that. It could just go, when I'm doing readings daily, right, and I don't know who these people are I'm talking with, but I can not only see them, not just merely into their personality, I can see deeply into their psychology and into their reason for why they're here. And my interest is not to, tell them who they should be and why or anything. No, I'm more interested in playing back to them what I see they are, what their challenges have been and are, and how those aren't just bad luck, but they're woven into the fabric of what their destiny is, which is, in one respect, to thrive and to engage in a very conscious, co-creative, meaningful participation in life and society and make contributions, but also it has this sort of awareness and strategy of how to overcome issues. That's where the healing comes in. The healing starts to go. Yeah, it's like I would, in fact, a good astrology reading, without even getting into techniques or anything, it can be very healing for people. I always call aligning their bodies, their mental, emotional, physical, spiritual bodies come into alignment. They feel like, whoa, and it can have over time. They feel good. They're kind of excited again. They're like, oh my God, it's me. And it's not an egocentric, it's me. It's just like, each person is, we're like, look at us. We're like miracle, like all life is a miracle. And we are conscious.
I think that's a great place in which to wrap it up, because, if you've been listening to this show and what you hear from Michael stirs you deeply, and you say, hey, he's talking a language that I want to know more about when it comes to who I am and why I'm here. How do people then get hold of you, Michael?
The best basic way is to go to my website, which is sunstarastrology.com. And I'd like to elaborate more on why I have that name for my business later, next in future interviews with you. But sunstarastrology.com, just go under book a reading. But there's also a contact section. I don't want to, chit-chat a ton and teach anybody much, but you can read under readings, all types of readings, and I do quite a different variety of types of readings. So that's bringing forward some of the traditional, but a lot of the techniques are modern too. But sunstarastrology.com, or if you wish, just go sunstarastrology@gmail.com, send me an email. And it can begin there, but once again, under book a reading on my website, there's a form you fill out: your name, your birthday, what kind of reading you want. Give me some background. Tell me a story. Like I give people the opportunity to give give me as much background really as they want, and I've had some people write quite a bit. I don't invite too much of that, but just bring me up to speed and. That's not like some people with, well, if you're an astrologer, you should know those things. It's like, no. I'd like to say some final words. It goes like this. There's so much to say about all of this, but as souls incarnate, we have signs, whatever your sun sign is, the moon sign, the ascendant, the planets, those are archetypal principles, and you as a soul are embodying them. So I'll say to a person, okay, your sun sign's Leo, let's say. So I'll say, well, how are you embodying that archetype? And the other planetary planets and signs, etc., and the overall configuration, the whole chart. That's a whole other discussion of holism. We look at the whole chart and begin to say, oh, let's say you're a Leo with the moon in Pisces, or you're a Leo with the moon in Leo, or you're a Leo with the moon in Capricorn. That's going to be different than the other Leos. And then, oh, you have a Leo with moon in Pisces and Mercury in Aquarius, or you're a Leo with moon in Capricorn with the Mercury in Aries. And it suddenly gets different and different and different. But even if you had two charts exactly the same, and I've had that with twins and all kinds of fun stuff, it comes down to, it remains, how are you embodying these archetypes? And that's where it comes right down to, your intuition, your genetics, certainly your embodiment, but it comes down to, you are the only one embodying these archetypes the way you are, and that starts getting exciting. It's both it's an invitation to engage in the co-creative process, but it also doesn't hurt to say it brings in a responsibility. But responsibility, if we grab hold of that in the accurate way I'm interpreting or suggesting it, that's our power. And our power here becomes an empowerment of ourselves to feel like, wow, there's meaning and purpose in my life and I'm in the game. And every little choice I make can be seen as having sort of meaningfulness. It's not just empty space moving from here to there anymore. It becomes this awakening state of wow, and like a realization. Wow, I'm a soul incarnate, and it starts. The implications of that take a while to digest. Sometimes, some are more aware, and some less, but all are souls. So anyway, these are examples, and I'd love to. That's what I do, and I enjoy it tremendously, and the sense of responsibility to what I do, but sharing insights about who people are and what their life's about and how they can engage in a conscious, co-creative way is very exciting, and looking forward to hearing from some of the people watching today, and I'm looking forward to future interviews.
Well, thank you, Michael. This is the first in a series of 4, and we'll be having Michael back as we go deeper into holism and holism, healing, and humanistic astrology as we go deeper and deeper. So thanks for being on the show. We'll be back same time, same place. So you can look for us on Facebook Live. It will also be released as a podcast through iTunes and through other media sources that will be available on Monday. And it will also be released on the Academy YouTube channel, and all this information will be in the show notes, which will be posted on Tyhson Banighen Facebook page. So thank you, Michael, for being on the show, and we'll talk again next week. Until then, have a great week, and I hope that you have many phone calls from interested people who want to make this journey with you.
Thank you very much.
Bye for now.
Okay, bye for now. Thank you.
For quality online wellness products, courses, and services, visit our sponsors, thewellnessstore.ca and the Extraordinary Healing Arts Academy located at thewellnessacademy.ca. To stay in touch, visit us at thewellnessshow.ca. And until next time, be healthy, wealthy, and wise.